Hi everyone, welcome back to Pens and Poison. I'm your host Liza, and today on Pens and Poison we will be discussing T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So last week we talked a little bit about the general background to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, but today we will be diving into the actual poem and starting with part one of the poem, which is called The Burial of the Dead. When we were discussing the introduction to T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, we talked a little bit about how the wasteland is a reinterpretation of the Fisher King myth. Today we'll talk a little bit about what the Fisher King has to do with the first part of the poem and discuss the general interpretation of the burial of the dead as a whole. In future videos, we will talk about parts 2 through 5 of The Wasteland as well. For those of you who are new here, welcome. My name is Liza. I am your host here on Pens and Poison. Really excited to bring The Wasteland to you guys today. This is a channel where we discuss all things poetry, and this week we will be looking at T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. The first thing to keep in mind with this poem is this is a poem about the futility of human desire, at least the first part. Let's start with the epigraph. The epigraph is always helpful to contextualize the poem and to give us a little bit of a preview in terms of what to expect. Eliot's epigraph to The Wasteland is quoted from the Satyricon. It is partially in Latin, partially in ancient Greek. I've taken a few semesters of Latin and a few of ancient Greek, so bear with me while we read the epigraph together. Nam sibilam quidem cumis ego ipse oculus meis vidi in ambula pendere, et cum illi puere dicerent, Sibilla, te felis, respondebat illa apothani vela. What does that mean? I saw the Cumaean Sibyl hanging in a jar, and when the boys asked her, Sibyl, what do you want? I answered, I want to die. Now, the myth of the Cumaean Sibyl follows the story of a woman who was granted a wish from the Greek god Apollo. Of course, this woman asked to live for as many years as there were grains of sand on the beaches of the earth. One thing she forgot to ask for, of course, was eternal youth. So now Sibyl is decaying, rotting, and suspended in a jar to survive. A couple of boys come up to her and ask, what do you want? Sibyl says, I want to die. A little bit morbid, but leads us into the main premise of the poem, which is, once again, death, futility, desire. Next, we have a dedication from Ezra Pound that says, to Ezra Pound, the better craftsman. As I said last week, Pound famously edited Eliot's The Wasteland, which, by the way, originally had the title He Do the Police in different voices, a reference to Charles Dickens' novel, Our Mutual Friend. We have a lot of different voices in The Wasteland, and we'll explore them in just a second here. The Wasteland opens with a famous allusion to Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales, for those of you who have not read this work, is a book about a pilgrimage. The book famously starts with the phrase, when that April with his shower sooth. It's a book about the rebirth of life in spring. It's a book about the positivity of spring, and it's a book about hope. The Wasteland takes that idea of April and turns it on its head. Spring is no longer about hope. It's now about futility. In The Wasteland, we have the line, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire. Spring turns to cruelty. Spring is no longer about safety. In fact, ironically, now it's winter that kept us warm. The narrator feels a little bit of fear. That fear is later released when we go down the mountains. In The Wasteland, intimacy is bound up with the feeling of fear. We next famously get the sermon stanza, which is reference to both Ecclesiastes and the book of Ezekiel. We have a reference to the prophet Ezekiel, who establishes a prophetic authority within the poem. When Marie feels frightened, her cousin negates her feeling of fear and isolation by taking her down the mountain, replacing her fear with the feeling of freedom. Here in the prophetic stanza, we have feelings that were earlier denied in the Marie episode. In the Marie episode, we have the feeling of anxiety, the release of anxiety through the act of sledding downwards. In the prophetic stanza, we have the act of rising, the culmination of all human experience, with fear and a handful of dust. Almost a direct juxtaposition to Marie's anxiety while sledding. This leads us into the famous Ecclesiastes reference, fear and a handful of dust. Here, we're meant to recall the futility of old age and the cumulative aspect of human experience in this feeling of dust. Once again, not a very positive image. Intimacy in the wasteland thus becomes very intimately bound up with this experience of fear. Then we have the famous allusion to Wagner's opera, Tristan und Isolde. Let's listen to the lines that Eliot excerpts from the opera.
Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu, mein irisch Kind, wo weilest du?
But wait a minute, why is Eliot using Wagner's opera Tristan? Wasn't Eliot referring originally to Wagner's opera Parsifal in the Percival story with the Fisher King? The theory that I have is Tristan is maybe even a little bit closer bound up with the themes of the poem. Tristan introduces the theme of futility of desire and the unnaturalness of intimacy. These lines are sung by the sailor. The sailor establishes a powerful sense of erotic longing. Taken by itself, the sailor's song has no obvious malicious intent. He sings of separation from his sweetheart. However, then we learn that Isolde, somewhere off the stage, overhears the sailor's song and immediately takes his lament as an invitation to rage against Tristan in the memory of her own betrothed, the Irish knight Morald. Tristan has famously slain the man who Isolde was supposed to marry. She doesn't really like him at the beginning of the opera. Isolde is very irritated when she hears the sailor's song. It stirs her a little bit to emotional agony here. When we hear this text for the second time in the opera, in the second scene, Isolde's glance now falls directly on Tristan. Once again, it represents that longing for her, and a sort of unattainable longing. The sailor's song thus represents both bereavement and passion for Isolde. Now we're in the hyacinth garden. Eliot loves to use flowers metaphorically. You see his rose garden later in the Four Quartets opening poem, Bert Norton. In Eliot's hyacinth garden, the love between the hyacinth girl and her lover possesses a sort of artificiality. It's actually very similar to the sort of artificial love that develops between Tristan and Isolde. Isolde and Tristan actually only fall for each other after drinking a love potion. At the end of the scene in the hyacinth garden in Eliot's poem, we actually get another quotation from Tristan and Isolde. Öd und leer das Meer. Desolate and empty is the sea. The hyacinth garden is thus framed by these two passages from Tristan and Isolde. The second line, the one about the sea, is sung by the role of a shepherd. The interesting thing is that the shepherd is usually sung by the same person in the opera who sings the sailor we see at the beginning of the opera. This means that they're reminiscent of one another. At this point in the opera, Kurvenal, Tristan's companion, and the shepherd are both in the castle garden. Once again, we have this theme of gardens, both in Eliot and in Wagner. Kurvenal and the shepherd are in this garden. They're looking out at sea. They're anticipating the coming of the ship that is supposed to carry Isolde. In this case, she's the only person who can heal Tristan's wound. What does that remind us of? The Fisher King. Now, Kurvenal asks the shepherd to pipe a merry tune, but instead the shepherd replies that the sea is desolate and empty. That's our quote in The Wasteland. Tristan's wound becomes associated with guilt. In the previous act, he's discovered making love to Isolde in a garden, and the guy who discovers them, Melot, wounds Tristan. We have the same motif here as in Parsifal's The Fisher King. In both cases, we have the motif of sexual guilt and sets up the motifs we'll find in the Hyacinth Garden and elsewhere in Eliot's poem. The difference, though, between Eliot's barren poem and Tristan und Isolde is that in the latter, hope will arrive in the form of the Liebestod, Isolde's eventual love death. We'll have in Tristan a transfiguration through death that will allow Tristan and Isolde to finally be together. This theme of transfiguration through death will perhaps resurface in Eliot, but at this point in the poem, we have no hope of salvation. In Wagner, death becomes the necessary prerequisite to the fulfillment of an otherwise unattainable desire. It's the bypath to change and transfiguration and ultimately a better future. Death allows Tristan and Isolde to reveal their true feelings for one another and escape the artificial worlds. In Eliot, the Hyacinth girl's failure with her lover mirrors the failure of Tristan und Isolde. They're both about unfulfilled longing. The moment that the Hyacinth girl apprehends the nature of her relationship with her unspecified lover, she cannot speak. She exists in this paralyzed limbo, very much like Isolde. But there's no hope here for her transfiguration. Instead, what she faces is utter loss of meaning in her relationship. I knew nothing. And then, after this continued strain of bleak imagery and bleakness in tone, the male figure in the garden looks into the heart of light. Perhaps a shred of hope, but maybe he's oblivious to the failure of his relationship and blindly convinces himself that there's hope with him and the Hyacinth Girl. They don't really understand one another. They're resurrecting their love in maybe an unnatural fashion. This phrase itself, the heart of light, of course recalls Joseph Conrad's work, The Heart of Darkness. We know that Eliot was a really big admirer of Conrad. In fact, he notably intended to extract the phrase Mr. Kurtz, he's dead, for the Wasteland epigraph, before it became the epigraph of one of Eliot's other famous poems, The Hollow Men. The tragedy of the world of the Hyacinth Garden here is that these lovers, and indeed lovers in general, can no longer recognize the beauty of genuine human connection. Instead, they content themselves with the empty erotic experience that exists in the lines of Eliot's poem. Later in the poem, spoiler, there will be hope or redemption. But for now, Eliot's going to introduce the theme of drowning in water. That'll help us get there. Now we have Madame Sosostris and her tarot cards. She draws the card of the Phoenician sailor. Another sailor. Water is going to be very, very important as we reach the culmination of this poem. Here, Eliot introduces the theme of water and death. We have another allusion to Shakespeare's The Tempest, a play that's famously about shipwreck and drowning. Those were pearls that were in his eyes. We also have the phrase, fear death by water. We'll revisit that a little bit later in the poem. Finally, we have the closing stanza of The Burial of the Dead, Eliot's famous Unreal City, which he himself claimed was a reinterpretation
of Baudelaire's Fourmillon Cité.
We have a reference to one of Eliot's favorite poets, Dante, in the line, "I had not thought death had undone so many." Of course, Dante visits hell and sees all of these dying souls as he progresses through each of the 9 circles of hell. We have a similar dynamic here, except the narrator of the poem is now walking the London streets. We revisit the theme of death and old age, and of course we have the garden once again. We have the line, "The corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout?" We have things growing from death. Once again, very morbid imagery, but very much aligned with what we learned about Tristan und Isolde's resurrection. And of course, the closing line to The Burial of the Dead, "You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère." Once again, Baudelaire, mon semblable, is this idea of repetition. We have these digging up of memories that we saw in the opening lines. So is this a poem about death and the futility of desire? Absolutely. We've seen in references to Wagner and other famous literary works that Eliot wants to show us the state of decay of human relationships and the human experience. At this stage in the poem, there is no hope for redemption. But as we'll see later in the poem, Eliot invites us to think about what we must do to resurrect these relationships and find hope for a better future. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned a little bit about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and the Burial of the Dead. Next week, we will be taking a look at the second part of The Wasteland, a game of chess. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. It really, really means the world to me to spread the love of literature and poetry. I hope you've all enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you next week for a game of chess. Thanks so much, guys.